I'm Rear Admiral Cecilia Jameson, 42 years old, a small-town mechanic's daughter who grew up watching her grandfather tune old radios and talk about duty. For years, I poured myself into someone else's future, supporting a man who laughed at mine. But when he turned my Navy dream into a punchline at a dinner table, I made a decision that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed or belittled by someone you gave everything to? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I share what happened next, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to reclaim your worth after being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about standing your ground, setting boundaries, and proving that quiet persistence always wins in the end. Because what came after might surprise you. My name is Cecilia Jameson, and I grew up in a town where the ocean met the town limits and not much happened beyond that. My father worked as a mechanic on the main drag, grease permanently under his fingernails, and my mother was a nurse at the county hospital. They were steady people, the kind who showed up and did the work without looking for recognition. I learned early that respect wasn't something you inherited. You earned it. My grandfather was a Navy man, a World War II aviator who flew missions over the Pacific and came home with stories he rarely told but somehow transmitted anyway. I'd sit in his workshop while he fixed old radio equipment, and I'd watch his hands move with precision and purpose. He never said, "You should join the Navy." He just lived in a way that made it impossible to want anything else. When he died during my sophomore year of high school, I knew exactly what I was going to do with my life. That's when I met Evan Brooks. He transferred to Lincoln High in junior year, and he had the kind of confidence that made people want to be around him. He was handsome in an understated way, genuinely smart, and he had plans. He talked about business school, about building something, about leaving our town behind. A lot of people in my class felt the same pull, but Evan articulated it better than most. I was drawn to that clarity, even though I was already certain about my own direction. We started dating during junior year, and for a while, it was easy. He'd drive me down to the pier at sunset, and we'd talk about what came after graduation. He asked about my Navy ambitions, and I told him everything: the pilot's certification I was working toward, the physical training regimen, the ROTC program I'd applied to at the state university. He listened, or seemed to, with his arm around me on the hood of his father's car. By senior year, things had shifted in ways I didn't fully recognize at the time. His remarks about my plans started small. "You sure you want to spend your 20s taking orders? Or, the Navy's a big commitment. You might change your mind once you're actually in." I'd respond by talking through my reasoning, as if explanation could convert skepticism into support. It never did. But I was 18, and I wanted him to want the same things I wanted, so I kept trying. When acceptance letters came, I got into the ROTC program with a full scholarship. Evan got into a decent business school 2 hours away. We decided to make it work long distance. I told myself that distance wasn't the same as absence, that commitment meant navigating obstacles together. My freshman year of college was harder than I expected. ROTC was physically demanding and emotionally intense. We did formations at 0600 hours, ran obstacle courses in the mud, and learned leadership theory alongside our regular coursework. My hands had calluses I'd never had before. I was building something in myself that I hadn't known was missing. When Evan visited, he seemed almost separate from that world. He'd complain about the cold, the early mornings, the other cadets' intensity. He'd laugh in a way that suggested all of it was slightly ridiculous. One weekend during my sophomore year, I came home to surprise him at his college. I showed up at his apartment with dinner, thinking it would be romantic. He was on the phone when I arrived, and he didn't hang up immediately. He finished his call, kissed me hello, but something had shifted. When I told him about my training, about being promoted to squad leader in our corps, his response was automatic. "That's good." "That's really good," but his eyes were already on his laptop. We broke up officially at the end of that year. It wasn't dramatic. We both knew it was coming. We were moving in different directions, and pretending otherwise had stopped working. I remember feeling relieved more than heartbroken, which told me something important about how I'd been spending my emotional energy. I'd been trying to convince him that my dream was worth supporting instead of simply living it. The next 2 years of ROTC, I stopped thinking about what other people thought of my path. I had mentors, officers who treated our ambitions as legitimate and worthy of their time. I studied harder, trained harder, and started to understand that my grandfather's wisdom had less to do with the Navy and more to do with self-respect. You couldn't ask someone else to believe in you if you didn't embody that belief first. When I commissioned as an ensign at 22 years old, my parents stood in the audience and cried. Evan was not invited. I wore my dress uniform, stood at attention as the commanding officer administered the oath, and felt something settle inside me that had been restless for years. This was mine. Not built on anyone's approval. Mine. My first posting was at Naval Air Station Kingsville in Texas. I was one of 3 women in a cohort of 22, and the Navy aviation community wasn't particularly welcoming to women in those days. But I was used to proving myself. I'd learned the grammar of competence early, and I spoke it fluently. I logged training hours, studied tactics, completed qualifications. I had a few friends among the other junior officers, people who understood that we were all running our own race, not competing against each other. A year into my commission, I heard through mutual friends that Evan had gotten engaged to someone named Chloe. She worked at his company. The wedding was in our hometown. I sent a gift, something appropriate and impersonal, and didn't think much about it. Or I told myself I didn't. The truth is I probably did think about it, in the way you think about something you're trying not to feel. By the time I was a full lieutenant at 25, I'd logged over 300 flight hours and was being considered for advanced training. I had an apartment near the base, a circle of friends who understood the rhythm of military life, and a sense of purpose that ran deeper than anything I'd felt before. When I ran in the morning before formation, when I sat through briefings on tactics and protocol, when I mentored younger ensigns just beginning their careers, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The life I was building didn't look like the life Evan was building. But I wasn't measuring myself against his anymore. That had been the real shift, not the breakup, but the moment I stopped wondering if he understood what I was doing and started trusting that it was worth understanding regardless. By my late 20s, I was a lieutenant, an O3 officer commanding a flight division. I'd moved through postings at Norfolk and Oceana, logged over 800 hours, and earned my warfare qualification. The Navy had become less of an ambition and more of an identity. I wasn't thinking about proving anything to anyone anymore. I was thinking about the pilots under my command, about mission readiness, about the strategic posture of our carrier group in the Indian Ocean. Evan existed in a different orbit. I'd see occasional social media posts. He'd made partner at his firm, bought a house in Charlotte with Chloe, was mentioned in a Business Journal article about emerging leaders in financial services. The posts were sparse enough that I didn't think about him regularly, but clear enough that I knew his life was progressing in the way he'd always wanted. Good for him. That's what I told myself. The early warning signs came from an unexpected source. Tessa Hall, who'd become my closest friend in the Navy. We'd met at Oceana as junior officers and had gravitated toward each other immediately. She was sharp, funny, and didn't take herself too seriously, which was a rare quality among people who spent their careers in high-stakes environments. Tessa became the person I called on difficult days, the person who understood why I'd skip social events to review operational readiness reports, the person who knew me well enough to notice when something was off. In the spring of my 28th year, I received an email from someone I didn't immediately recognize, the reunion committee for Lincoln High. They were organizing a 20-year reunion. 20 years. It didn't feel possible that a decade had passed since I'd graduated, much less that enough time had accumulated to call for formal reflection. The email included a list of classmates who'd already RSVP'd. Evan's name was on it. Chloe's name was on it too. I almost deleted it without responding. There was no obligation. Lincoln felt like something I'd moved through, a place that had taught me what I needed to know and sent me forward. But something made me open it again. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the kind of closure that only certain moments could provide. I mentioned it to Tessa during one of our runs around the base. We were doing 6 miles at an easy pace, the kind of distance where conversation became meditative rather than demanding. "You're actually considering going?" she asked between breaths. "I don't know. Maybe. It's been a long time. You don't owe anyone in that town anything, see?" She was right, of course. But that's not what reunion attendance was really about. It wasn't about obligation. It was about something quieter, the human need to mark passages, to see how far you'd traveled, to measure the distance in concrete terms. Around the same time, something shifted in my operational assignments. I was recommended for a senior intelligence command position, a post that would require me to relocate to the Pentagon for a 3-year assignment. It was a significant opportunity, the kind that set officers on a trajectory toward flag rank. It was also demanding. The work would be complex, the hours unpredictable, and the isolation significant. I'd be working on strategic-level problems, collaborating with other branches, and operating at a level of responsibility I'd never managed before. When my commanding officer presented the opportunity, he framed it clearly. "This is a career maker, Jameson. People like you, people who know how to lead and think strategically, people like you become admirals from positions like this. But you need to know what it costs." I asked him to be specific. "It costs relationships. It costs spontaneity. It costs the idea that your life is yours to control. But it gives you something else. It gives you the ability to shape outcomes at scale. Most people never get that." I accepted the position. The jokes about my career had become more frequent over the years, though I'd rarely been present to hear them directly. Tessa had mentioned them in passing, stories from mutual friends about gatherings where Evan would make remarks. "Still playing soldier?" or "Cecilia always was dedicated to her little fantasy." The tone was dismissive, the kind of humor that works best when the target isn't in the room. Tessa had defended me each time, but I could hear in her voice that she found it exhausting, the casual belittling of a commitment he'd never bothered to understand. During one phone call, Tessa was more direct than usual. "He's made a thing out of it, hasn't he? Like your career is somehow a personal failing on his part." "People are allowed to not understand things," I said. "I'm not going to spend energy being bothered by it." But I was bothered, or I would have been if I let myself sit with it long enough. It was the particular sting of being dismissed by someone who once mattered. Not because his dismissal could alter what I'd accomplished, but because it represented something I'd never managed to communicate, that my ambitions weren't born from rebellion against him or against our town. They were born from something deeper, something that had nothing to do with him at all. The Pentagon posting began in the summer. I was promoted to lieutenant commander and for officer now, commanding staff officers twice my age, managing intelligence assessments that affected fleet movements and strategic planning. I had a small apartment in Arlington, a commute that started before dawn, and a schedule that made maintaining friendships difficult. Tessa and I promised to stay in touch. We managed video calls once a month, texts more frequently. She was promoted to commander and transferred to San Diego. We were both climbing the same ladder, but on different rungs, at different times, in ways that meant we saw each other less often but understood each other more deeply. The reunion invitation sat in my email, unanswered. I knew what I would face: questions about my personal life, the unspoken suggestion that a woman my age should have accumulated a husband and children by now. I knew that Evan would be there with Chloe, that they would present a particular version of success that looked more like the version our hometown understood. And I knew that I had nothing to prove, which was the only reason I could allow myself to consider going. On a Friday night in late August, during a rare evening when my schedule was clear, I responded to the reunion committee. I said yes. I didn't know why exactly. I only knew that the woman who'd left Lincoln High was not the woman I'd become, and perhaps it was worth letting that distance be witnessed. Perhaps there was something in standing in that gymnasium or banquet hall that would crystallize everything I'd learned about the space between ambition and apology, between what others thought of you and what you'd actually managed to build. I didn't tell Evan I was coming. That seemed important, though I couldn't articulate why. Not telling him meant that my appearance would be a genuine surprise, which meant that if there was any moment of awkwardness or revelation, at least it would be authentic rather than performed. The betrayal wasn't the engagement that I'd already absorbed years earlier. The betrayal was the accumulation, the way dismissal had calcified into contempt, and contempt had become a kind of entertainment. Tessa told me the full story during a call in late spring, a year before the reunion. She'd run into someone from Lincoln at a conference, a woman named Jessica who'd gone to high school with both of us. Jessica mentioned that at a dinner party Evan had hosted, just a casual gathering of his business peers and their spouses, he'd brought me up deliberately. Not in response to a question about old friends or a natural conversational turn. He'd brought me up as a setup to a joke. He said something like, "You know what's wild? My ex-girlfriend insisted she was going to be this hotshot Navy pilot," Jessica had told Tessa. And then he laughed and said, "Still chasing your little army dream," like he was quoting something she'd said. And everyone at the table laughed. I listened to Tessa relay this, and I felt something I hadn't felt before. Not heartbreak. Something colder and more clarifying. It was the recognition that I'd given Evan credit for a kind of innocence he'd never possessed. I'd assumed his dismissal came from a place of simple incomprehension. But this was different. This was mockery constructed for an audience, designed to diminish me in order to elevate himself. "He's a small person, see," Tessa said quietly. "And you're not. That's all that's happening here." The reunion was scheduled for the last weekend in September. Our 20th. 2 decades since we'd sat in that gymnasium for graduation, since I'd worn a cap and gown and listened to speeches about potential and futures. I'd been commissioned as an ensign by then, my career already beginning, though most of my class didn't register that as real. The Navy was still an abstraction to them, something I was doing, not something I was becoming. I arranged leave from the Pentagon. My commanding officer asked why I was taking personal time, and I told him I was attending a high school reunion. He nodded and didn't question it. Military culture understood the compartmentalization required to move through life, work, family, obligation, identity. You balance them all by keeping them separate. The night before the reunion, I drove through Lincoln's town center. Nothing had changed fundamentally, which was both comforting and disorienting. The same storefronts, the same arrangement of streets, the same sight lines toward the ocean. But the people I'd known had scattered and transformed, and I'd transformed the most radically of all. My uniform was hanging in the hotel room. I'd wear it tomorrow. Not as a prop or a statement, but because it was accurate. The reunion was held at a hotel ballroom downtown. When I arrived, I wore civilian clothes, dark trousers, and a fitted blouse. I wanted to observe before being observed. The room was a disorienting mix of familiar and foreign. People I recognized immediately stood next to people whose names I had to search for on the name tags. There were some happy reunions, people who'd remained close or had reconnected meaningfully. There were awkward conversations between people who'd never known each other well and had no reason to start now. I found Tessa's friend Jessica, who came to the reunion specifically to see people she'd stayed close to. She hugged me and said, "You look exactly the same." "That's kind," I said. "I don't feel the same." No one does. That's the point, I think. We talked for a while about the intervening years. She'd become a teacher, had 2 kids, lived in the town I'd grown up in. Her life was close to home in a way mine had moved infinitely away from. But she didn't talk about that gap as a failure on her part or a boast on mine. It was just the shape her life had taken, and the shape mine had taken, and there was nothing to measure between them. Then I saw Evan. He was across the room, talking to a cluster of people from our graduating class. He hadn't changed as much as I might have hoped. He was still handsome in that particular way, though his face had hardened slightly, the softness of youth calcified into something more deliberate. Chloe was beside him, wearing a tasteful dress, smiling in the way women smile when they're standing beside their husbands at social functions where they don't know many people. He saw me. I watched recognition cross his face, followed immediately by something else, a recalibration of his expression, an assessment of what my presence might mean. I didn't approach him. I let him come to me, which he did after a few minutes, once he'd extracted himself from his conversation. "Cecilia," he said. The tone was familiar, like he was summoning a memory he wanted to verify. "I didn't know you were coming." "Last-minute decision," I said. It wasn't true, but it positioned me as someone with options, someone whose attendance was an afterthought rather than a carefully considered choice. "You look well." "Still in the military." "Still in the Navy, yes." "That's admirable," he said, and I heard the capital A in the word. Admirable the way you might call climbing Everest admirable, impressive in its futility, exotic in its impracticality. "You must have some stories." Chloe appeared at his elbow, and he introduced me as an old friend, an ex-girlfriend, carefully framed to diminish the duration or depth of what we'd been to each other. She shook my hand. I recognized the look on her face. It was the look of a woman who'd been told enough about an ex to know I represented something her husband had successfully moved past. I felt almost sorry for her, standing there in her tasteful dress, knowing only the curated version of his history. "What do you do now?" Chloe asked. The question was polite, but it wasn't genuinely curious. She was performing the work of being a good wife at a social event, asking the kinds of questions that demonstrated that she was interested in other people's lives. "I work in defense and logistics," I said. It was technically accurate and completely uninformative. "Oh, that must be interesting," she said, and I could see her mind already moving to other conversational terrain. I excused myself to get a drink. As I moved through the room, I could feel Evan watching me. I imagined him reconstructing his narrative about me to Chloe, defending his earlier mockery, explaining why the woman he'd just spoken to wasn't actually worth his concern. I didn't care. Or I'd learned to care in a different way than I had in my 20s, not in a way that bent me toward his approval, but in a way that clarified what his dismissal meant about him rather than about me. The evening moved forward in the way reunions do, a series of conversations that felt both meaningful and performative, people catching up on the broad strokes of their lives while avoiding the crevasses where real depth might emerge. I talked to people I genuinely liked in high school, people I'd forgotten I'd known, people who'd formed memories of me that I hadn't known existed. One of my teachers was there, Mr. Sullivan, who'd taught advanced placement history. He remembered me as the student who always had questions, who'd pushed back on the narrative arc he presented, who'd wanted to understand the human complexity beneath the historical timelines. We talked for nearly an hour about education, about how the people we were supposed to become weren't always the people we actually became, about the particular strength required to hold a vision of yourself when the world was suggesting you adjust it. By the time I sat down for dinner, I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the drive or the day. It was the specific exhaustion that comes from holding space for your own past, from being in a room where you'd once belonged and now existed as a kind of visitor. The dining tables were arranged with name cards, and I found myself seated between a man named David who'd been quarterback of the football team and was now a personal trainer, and Jessica again, who'd sought me out deliberately to sit near someone she actually wanted to talk to. During dinner, I could hear Evan's voice from across the room. He was telling a story, gesturing expansively, and everyone at his table was laughing. I didn't try to hear what he was saying, but I recognized the register, the careful construction of himself as someone worthy of attention, someone whose observations mattered, someone whose amusement was valuable currency. When the announcer called for the evening to transition into the formal program, speeches, recognitions, some entertainment by a cover band, I felt a shift in my own posture. The informal part of the reunion was ending. We were moving toward the constructed, the ceremonial, the moment where the reunion would attempt to create meaning retroactively. The principal from our high school, now retired, gave a speech about legacy and growth. He talked about how the students he'd known had gone on to make significant contributions in their fields. He mentioned a few people by name, a judge, a neurosurgeon, a congressman. He didn't mention me, which was fine. There wasn't a precise civilian equivalent to my rank that would translate clearly to people who didn't understand military hierarchy. Then the evening organizer came to the microphone. She was someone I vaguely remembered from student government, a woman named Deborah Myers who'd been 2 years behind us and had apparently returned to Lincoln to teach and eventually lead the school. She had note cards in her hands, and she looked genuinely pleased to be there. "Before we bring out the band, I want to mention that we have a very special guest with us this evening," she said. Many of you know that she graduated with the class of 2004, though she left Lincoln to pursue an extraordinary career in service. She's risen to a rank that very few people achieve, and she's here to say a few words. Please welcome our keynote speaker, Rear Admiral Cecilia Jameson. The room went quiet in a way that suggested people were recalibrating their understanding of who I was. Rear Admiral. The rank registered, or at least its weight registered, even if the specific meaning didn't translate clearly to everyone. I watched Evan's expression shift into something I could identify immediately, shock, followed by a rapid attempt to mask it. I'd known this was coming. I'd confirmed it with Deborah when I arrived, had spoken to her about my willingness to say something brief. But I hadn't let myself anticipate this exact moment, the specific angle of how it would unfold, the precise way that context could reorganize everything that had come before. I walked to the microphone. I was still in civilian clothes, but somehow that mattered less than the fact that the category I occupied had just been publicly named. I took a moment before speaking, something I'd learned in command, that silence can communicate as much as words, that the space you hold has value. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you all for that warm welcome. I have to admit, I didn't anticipate this when I decided to come home for the reunion. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to say this in front of people who knew me before I knew who I was. I paused, looking out at the room. My eyes met Evan's for a fraction of a second, and I watched him process something he hadn't anticipated. I grew up in this town with specific ideas about what mattered. My father was a mechanic, my mother was a nurse. They showed me that respect came from doing the work, not from talking about it. My grandfather was a Navy aviator, and he showed me that service was a form of integrity. When I left Lincoln, I had a very clear vision of the path I wanted to follow. Not everyone understood it. Some people thought it was a phase, something I'd grow out of. Some people made jokes about it. I let that land without bitterness, just a statement. But I learned something over the past 20 years that I think matters. Dreams don't require other people's permission. Ambition doesn't require validation. You can be dismissed, mocked, misunderstood, and still move forward. In fact, sometimes the clarity you gain from being underestimated becomes your greatest strength. I looked directly at Evan now. Not with anger or triumph, just with recognition. The Navy taught me that respect is earned through consistent effort, through integrity even when no one's watching, through mentorship and service, and the quiet acknowledgement that you're part of something larger than yourself. I commissioned as an ensign at 22 years old. I've logged over 3,000 flight hours. I've commanded pilots, managed intelligence operations, and had the privilege of working with people who dedicate their lives to protecting the interests of this nation. I did that not to prove anyone wrong, but to prove to myself that I was capable of becoming who I wanted to be. I paused, let my gaze move across the room, acknowledging the people who'd supported me, the teachers who'd believed in me, the friends who'd stayed connected. If you're sitting here with ambitions that other people don't understand, or dreams that seem impractical to everyone around you, I want you to know that the distance between their skepticism and your success is just time. And you have time. You have exactly as much time as you need to become who you're determined to be. I stepped back from the microphone. The applause was immediate and sustained. I could see Jessica crying, could see Mr. Sullivan nodding in recognition, could see David leaning back in his chair with an expression of profound respect. And I could see Evan, his face drained of color, his hand resting on Chloe's arm, his entire architecture of certainty about who I was and what I'd accomplished fundamentally reorganized in the space of 5 minutes. I returned to my seat and watched the room recalibrate around me. People who'd spoken to me earlier in the evening were looking at me differently now. The woman who worked in defense and logistics had suddenly become concrete, had a title, had a visible trajectory that existed outside their frame of reference. Some of the shift was genuine recognition of accomplishment. Some of it was the particular recalibration that happens when you place someone in a category you actually understand: prestigious, rare, difficult to achieve. Evan came to find me after I'd moved to the edge of the reception area, away from the main crowd. His expression was carefully composed, but I could see the effort it cost him to maintain that composure. "Rear Admiral," he said. The title sounded foreign in his mouth, like he was testing it to see if it fit. That was quite a speech. "Thank you," I said simply. I had no idea. He said it with genuine confusion, as if my rise in rank had been something I'd kept hidden rather than something he'd simply never thought to understand. "You never mentioned it. We haven't spoken in over 20 years, Evan." "I know, but but he paused, recalibrating his approach. Chloe and I would love to take you to dinner before you leave town. Catch up properly. There was something in that offer, a desire to retroactively establish familiarity, to position our reunion within a frame of continuity rather than what it actually was, a complete divergence of paths. He wanted to contain what had just happened in the ballroom, to domesticate it, to transform it into something manageable. That's kind, I said. But I fly back tomorrow morning. My schedule's committed. Of course. He nodded, accepted the rejection. But I want you to know I'm proud of you. What you've accomplished. That's extraordinary. The words felt like they were supposed to absolve him of something, like pride could retroactively justify dismissal. I didn't argue the point. I just smiled in a way that suggested polite agreement while maintaining distance, and after a moment, he excused himself and returned to Chloe. I left the reunion early. I didn't stay for the band or the extended socializing. I drove back to my hotel in silence, turned on the television to white noise, and sat in the quiet of the room. The speech had been good, I knew that objectively. It had accomplished what I'd wanted it to accomplish, had crystallized the distance between Evan's version of who I was and the reality of what I'd become. But there was no satisfaction in that crystallization. If anything, it clarified something I'd already known, that I had nothing to prove to him, had never needed to prove anything to him, and would never gain anything of real value from his validation. The next morning, I drove back to my hotel near the airport. I'd checked out the previous night, so I had time to sit in the terminal and think about the reunion with the kind of clarity that only distance provides. What struck me most powerfully was how little Evan's reaction mattered. I'd spent years, unconsciously, maintaining a version of him in my mind, someone whose dismissal was worth contending with. But the actual Evan, sitting across from me at dinner, was smaller than that mental architecture. He was just a man who'd made certain choices, had built a certain kind of life, and had chosen to mock something he didn't understand rather than ask genuine questions about it. I'd chosen differently. I'd chosen to let the mocking stand without response, to channel any sting it caused into motivation, to prove myself to myself rather than to him. And that choice had made all the difference. When I got back to the Pentagon, my commanding officer called me into his office. He'd heard about the reunion, about my speech. He wanted to discuss something, a nomination for a position at Naval Intelligence Command, a post that would position me for promotion to Rear Admiral the following year. It was the kind of opportunity that would alter the trajectory of my career in significant ways, that would place me at a strategic level I'd only glimpsed in theory. "You're ready," he said simply. "More ready than most people who reach this level. The question is whether you want it." I told him I needed to think about it. The truth was more complicated. The question of what I wanted had become increasingly difficult to answer as my career progressed. I'd spent decades building toward a specific vision of accomplishment, but now that I was approaching it, I had to ask myself what would come after. At 42 years old, I'd sacrificed relationships, stability, the kind of personal continuity that anchored most people's lives. I'd done it consciously, had never resented the cost. But I hadn't anticipated that reaching the goal would not feel like an arrival so much as a recalibration. I called Tessa that evening. She was stationed in San Diego, commanding a destroyer squadron. She'd also been approached about flag rank, had also been wrestling with the same questions about cost and meaning. "I think you should do it," she said without hesitation. "We didn't come this far to stop now. Did we come this far for a specific reason, or just because stopping felt like failure?" She was quiet for a moment. "Both, probably. But that doesn't make it less true. We've shaped the Navy in certain ways. We could shape it more at the flag level." She was right. The Navy I'd entered 20 years earlier was not the Navy I was commanding in now. More women held senior positions, more junior female officers saw pathways to advancement that hadn't existed in my early career. I'd been part of creating that shift, even as I'd been climbing my own ladder. At flag rank, I could shape policy in ways that would have cascading effects for people who came after me. I accepted the nomination. The process took several months, background investigations that were thorough, interviews with senior leadership, the kind of vetting that precedes significant advancement. By spring of the following year, I received confirmation that I'd been selected for promotion. In the fall, I'd be selected for Rear Admiral. The night I got the official notification, I sat in my Arlington apartment and thought about Evan Brooks at his dinner parties, making jokes to audiences who'd never know the specifics of what he was dismissing. I thought about my grandfather in his workshop, fixing radios with precision. I thought about my parents, whose steady presence had given me the template for the kind of integrity I'd spent my career building. I didn't feel triumph. I felt completion, which is quieter and more durable than triumph. The goal I'd set for myself had been achieved. Not as a response to anyone's mockery, but as the logical conclusion of consistent effort, good mentorship, and the particular grace that sometimes accompanies dedication. By my early 40s, I'd become the kind of officer that other officers watched. Not with envy, though there was some of that. With genuine curiosity about how someone sustained that level of commitment while maintaining any kind of personhood outside of rank. The answer was less dramatic than people seemed to expect. I'd made choices. Some of them had been difficult, but they'd been clear. I'd never married. I'd never had children. I'd had relationships that lasted a few years, with men who understood the demands of military life, who didn't require me to prioritize them in ways that would have cost me professionally. We'd been good to each other, but not in the way that created permanent bonds. When it became clear that we wanted different things, when their ambitions pulled them toward stability and mine pulled me toward complexity, we'd acknowledged that and moved on. Tessa had married once, briefly, to another naval officer. It hadn't survived her deployment schedule or his assignment to a different coast. They'd remained friends, but the marriage had been a casualty of the kind of life we'd chosen. She'd never tried again. She'd built her social structure around her career, around the people who understood the particular texture of naval life, around the friendships that could accommodate months of separation and the kind of intensity that only emerged when you understood each other's professional lives. My promotion to Rear Admiral came through in the fall of my 42 year. The ceremony was held at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. My parents attended, though my father had begun to show signs of the cognitive decline that would eventually consume him. My mother held his hand throughout the ceremony, and when I was promoted, she cried in a way that suggested she understood that this moment represented something beyond the rank. It represented the fulfillment of a promise I'd made to myself at 16 years old, standing in my grandfather's workshop, understanding that respect was something you built, not something you inherited. I wore the uniform, stood at attention as Admiral Catherine Morrison pinned the insignia on my collar. The two-star insignia, the Rear Admiral rank, felt simultaneously substantial and incomplete. I'd become what I'd set out to become, but I was already aware that the striving didn't stop. At flag rank, there were new challenges, new political landscapes to navigate, new ways that ego and ambition could calcify into rigidity rather than strength. My first posting as Rear Admiral was at Naval Intelligence Command, where my commanding officer had predicted I'd eventually land. I was 51 years old, commanding intelligence operations, overseeing strategic assessments, and working at a level where the decisions I made affected policy in ways that rippled through entire fleets. I had staff officers who reported to me, people with 20 years of experience looking to me for direction and oversight. The responsibility was absolute and unrelenting. I mentored younger female officers deliberately. There was no requirement for me to do so, but it seemed important. I'd benefited from mentorship. Commander Ruiz had believed in me when I was 23 years old and uncertain about my place in the Navy aviation community. I'd had teachers and commanding officers who'd seen potential in me before I'd fully recognized it myself. I could do the same for the next generation. I created a mentorship program within my command specifically for junior female officers. We met monthly, discussed challenges specific to their advancement, talked about the kinds of decisions they'd need to make about career versus personal life. I was honest about what I'd sacrificed, about what I'd gained, about the particular kind of loneliness that sometimes accompanied achievement at this level. One of the younger officers, a lieutenant named Sarah Chin, asked me directly during one of our sessions, "Did you ever regret it? Choosing career over everything else?" I took my time answering. "No," I said finally. but not because I think I made the objectively correct choice. I made the choice that was correct for me. Someone else might have made a different choice and felt equally certain about it. What matters is that you make the choice consciously, knowing what the trade-offs are, and then you don't spend your life resenting the choice you made. But don't you get lonely? Sarah was younger, 28, ambitious, talented. She was also beginning to understand the particular calculus of advancement. Yes, I said. Sometimes. But I've learned that loneliness isn't always a sign you've made the wrong choice. Sometimes loneliness is just the particular texture of a life lived at a certain intensity with certain people. It doesn't mean the life isn't worth living. I meant it. The isolation I sometimes felt at flag rank wasn't the result of failure or mistake. It was simply the cost of the particular kind of achievement I'd chosen. I had deep friendships, Tessa and I remained close, despite geographic distance. I had professional relationships that held genuine affection and mutual respect. I had a sense of purpose that anchored me in ways that romantic relationships typically served for other people. It was a different architecture than most people built, but it was structurally sound. During my second year at Naval Intelligence Command, I received a notification that Lincoln High was organizing a memorial for teachers who'd passed away. My former AP history teacher, Mr. Sullivan, had died the previous spring. The school was hosting a gathering to celebrate his legacy, and they were inviting former students to share memories. I was invited specifically because I'd maintained contact with him over the years, had visited him during leaves when I was stationed closer to home. I almost didn't go. The memorial would be crowded with people from my past, would require me to be in Lincoln again, would potentially mean encountering Evan or others who'd witnessed the reunion speech. But Mr. Sullivan had meant something real to me. He'd been one of the first people to take my ambitions seriously, to treat my questions as legitimate intellectual inquiry rather than youthful rebellion. I owed him the presents. I flew home on a Friday evening. I wore civilian clothes but carried my dress uniform in my flight bag. I had a room at the same hotel where the reunion had been held, though that felt like a lifetime ago rather than a few years. The memorial was held at the school on Saturday morning. I walked into the gymnasium where I'd graduated, where I'd sat during assemblies, where I'd competed in sports and attended pep rallies. It was simultaneously the same and completely transformed. The architecture was unchanged, but its meaning had shifted. I was no longer a student here. I was an adult who had become something significant in the world, and that transformation altered how I occupied the space. I ran into Evan in the hallway. He was with Chloe again, which meant they were still together, still building the life they'd built. He looked older, not in a bad way, just in the way people who'd lived a particular kind of life eventually aged. He had the look of someone who'd been successful in conventional ways, who'd gained the external markers that society recognized as achievement. Cecilia, he said. The name still felt awkward in his mouth. I heard you were back in town. Mr. Sullivan's memorial, I said. He was important to me. Of course. He was a great teacher. Evan nodded, accepting this explanation. I saw the news about your promotion. Rear Admiral. That's incredible. The word incredible suggested that he still couldn't quite encompass the reality of what I'd accomplished. It existed outside his frame of reference in a way that made it feel almost fictional. Thank you, I said. I'm glad we ran into each other. But I should find a seat. The program's starting. I moved past him into the gymnasium. I didn't feel angry or dismissive. I just felt the simple recognition that we inhabited completely different worlds now, and there was no purpose in pretending otherwise. During the memorial, people stood and shared memories of Mr. Sullivan. How he'd inspired them to pursue certain fields, how he'd pushed them to think more carefully about the world, how he'd treated them as thinking adults worthy of intellectual engagement. When it was my turn, I stood and talked about the afternoon he'd defended my questions in front of a student who'd suggested I was being disrespectful by challenging the material. He'd said, "Cecilia's not being disrespectful. She's being rigorous. If you can't defend your position, you need to think harder about whether it's accurate." That lesson stayed with me, I told the assembled group. In the Navy, I've had to defend positions, challenge assumptions, push back on conventional wisdom. That willingness to interrogate what you're told, that came from Mr. Sullivan. He modeled intellectual integrity in a way that shaped how I approached leadership. I'm grateful for that. I sat down. The rest of the memorial proceeded in the way memorials do, a mixture of genuine grief and the particular kind of reflection that death occasions. By the end of the morning, people had shared enough stories that Mr. Sullivan's life felt appropriately honored, his impact adequately recognized. That evening, I had dinner with Tessa, who'd flown in from San Diego specifically for the memorial. We sat at a restaurant overlooking the ocean, the same view my grandfather had loved, and talked about the particular way that returning to your hometown recalibrates your understanding of who you've become. Did you see him? Tessa asked. She didn't need to specify which him. Evan. Yeah, in the hallway. How'd it feel? Neutral, I said. And it was true. Like seeing someone from a previous life who'd mattered once, but didn't anymore. That's growth, Tessa said, smiling. Remember when his dismissal could actually hurt? I was 25. You were 25 and brilliant and underestimated, and you still let him make you question yourself. For a minute, I said. Not anymore. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun descend toward the horizon. After 43 years of life, 15 of those at flag rank or approaching it, I'd come to understand something that was less poetic, but more durable than most of the lessons I'd learned. That respect was exactly what Commander Ruiz had told me it was. You didn't prove people wrong by talking. You proved them wrong by lasting. By continuing to show up, by maintaining your integrity even when no one was watching, by building something that endured beyond the moment of its creation. 2 years after the memorial, I received notification that Lincoln High was organizing its 25-year reunion. A quarter century. The number was significant in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd spent more than half my life in the military now. I'd become someone that my high school self could barely have imagined, not because the vision was impossible, but because I'd had to become so much more precise, so much more rigorous, so much more willing to sacrifice in order to achieve it. The reunion committee reached out directly. They wanted me to speak again, not just to attend. They wanted a formal keynote address, the kind that would anchor the evening's events. I considered declining. I'd already made my statement at the 20-year reunion. There was no additional point to prove, no vindication left to claim. But I thought about the young officers I was mentoring, about Sarah Chen and the others who were still figuring out whether their ambitions were worth the costs they'd extract. I thought about the students who might be sitting in Lincoln High right now, uncertain about their paths, wondering whether their dreams were too unconventional, too demanding, too likely to be dismissed by people they cared about. I agreed to return and speak. The reunion was scheduled for late September, which meant I had months to prepare. I was working with the Joint Chiefs by then, had transitioned into a role that positioned me for promotion to Admiral, a 1-star flag rank that would make me one of the highest-ranking women in the Navy's history. The work was consuming. It required me to think at scales I'd never accessed before, to understand strategic implications that rippled across the entire Department of Defense, to operate in rooms where my gender was still a statistical anomaly and my competence was still occasionally questioned despite my rank. But I made space for the reunion. I wrote and rewrote my remarks, trying to find language that would capture what I'd learned without resorting to the kind of triumph that had perhaps undercut my first speech. I wanted to talk about failure, about the times I'd been passed over for advancement, about the moments I'd questioned whether I belonged at the level I'd achieved. I wanted to talk about the particular kind of vulnerability that came with being a woman advancing through male-dominated hierarchies, about the ways that gender complicated leadership in ways that male officers often didn't have to contend with. About 2 weeks before the reunion, I received an email from Evan. He said he wanted to have coffee before the event, said he'd been thinking about our last encounter, and felt like there was something unresolved between us. He framed it as an opportunity to clear the air, which suggested that he'd been holding onto some version of hurt or misunderstanding about how our interactions had gone. I almost deleted the email without responding. But something made me agree to meet him. Not because I thought the conversation would be productive or meaningful, but because I was curious about what he wanted to say, what he needed to resolve in order to feel adequate about his own life. We met at a coffee shop near the pier, the same pier where he'd taken me during high school. He looked older now, his hair had grayed at the temples, his face had developed the particular kind of lines that came from spending years in climate-controlled offices under fluorescent lights. He ordered black coffee, the same way I did, and we sat in a corner of the shop with the kind of physical distance that suggested we were having a transaction rather than a genuine conversation. "I've thought a lot about the reunion," he said without preamble. "About what you said, about how your speech positioned things." "Okay," I said. I didn't elaborate or encourage him to continue. I let him carry the weight of the conversation. "I want you to know that I wasn't mocking you. When I made those comments, back then, still chasing your little army dream, it wasn't about dismissing what you wanted. It was about not understanding it. There's a difference." I considered this. He was right, technically. There was a difference between mockery born from active contempt and dismissal born from simple incomprehension. But the distinction hadn't mattered much at the time, and it didn't particularly matter now. "Okay," I said again. "I've done well for myself," he continued. "Chloe and I have a good life. But I've also watched what you've accomplished, and I've realized that I made a choice not to take you seriously when we were young. I could have. I chose not to." He looked at me, and I could see that this admission was costing him something. He wanted absolution, wanted me to tell him that it didn't matter, that his choice to mock me had been irrelevant to my trajectory. And it had been irrelevant. But I also wasn't going to provide the comfort he was seeking. Not because I was vindictive, but because it wasn't true, and because I'd learned that the kindest thing you could do for someone was to tell them the truth rather than the version of truth that made them feel better. "You're right," I said. "You made that choice. And I made the choice not to let it matter. That's how I moved forward." "Do you resent me?" he asked. The question hung between us. I thought about the answer carefully. Resentment implied ongoing anger, ongoing investment in what he'd done or failed to do. And I didn't have that. What I had was recognition that he was someone I'd cared about once, who'd failed to understand me, and who I'd ultimately left behind in order to become who I needed to become. "No," I said finally. "I don't resent you. But I also don't think your validation, or lack thereof, has any bearing on my life. You were part of my life once. You're not anymore. That's not tragic. It's just how things are." He nodded, accepted this. We talked for a few more minutes about neutral topics, how our families were, what was happening in our shared hometown, the particular way that time had transformed the landscape we'd grown up in. It was cordial, the way conversations between acquaintances tend to be. Then he finished his coffee, said he was glad we'd had the chance to talk, and left. I sat alone in the coffee shop for a while afterward. I didn't feel sad or triumphant. I felt something simpler and more durable: acceptance. He'd been part of my story, but only in the way that certain people are part of your story. They mark passages, they provide contrast, they clarify what you value by demonstrating what you don't. But they're not the central narrative. You are. The night before the reunion, I checked into the same hotel where I'd stayed for the previous reunion. I laid out my dress uniform on the bed, the uniform with the 2 stars that indicated my rank, the medals and ribbons that represented deployments and commendations, and the particular kind of achievement that only accumulated over decades. I looked at the uniform and thought about the 18-year-old girl who'd left Lincoln High certain about her direction, but uncertain about the cost. She couldn't have imagined this version of herself. She couldn't have anticipated the discipline required, the sacrifices demanded, the particular kind of loneliness that accompanied achievement at this level. But she would have recognized the core of it, the refusal to accept other people's definitions of what was possible for her, the commitment to something that felt larger than herself, the understanding that respect was something you built through consistent effort rather than something you inherited or demanded. I called Tessa that evening. She was in Washington for a conference and had arranged to attend the reunion as well. We were going to appear together, which felt appropriate somehow, 2 women who'd chosen the same kind of path, who'd sacrificed in similar ways, who'd supported each other across the decades of their rise. "Nervous?" she asked. "No," I said. And I wasn't. I'd said what needed to be said at the last reunion. This time, I was simply going to show up and represent the reality of what commitment looked like, what it produced, what it required, and what it offered in return. The reunion was held at the same venue as before, the hotel ballroom with its generic elegance and its capacity to transform itself into whatever context the occasion demanded. The room had been decorated with photographs from our graduating class, images of us at 18, impossibly young, caught in the particular suspension of adolescence. There were photos from football games and dances and graduation itself. There were images of people I'd completely forgotten, classmates who'd occupied my immediate world for 4 years and then vanished entirely from my life. I arrived early, before most people had assembled. The reunion committee wanted to brief me on the format, wanted to ensure I knew how the evening would flow. Deborah Myers, the same woman who'd introduced me at the 20-year reunion, was now the superintendent of the school district. She'd aged in the way people age when they're deeply invested in their work, visibly tired, but also more settled, more confident in who they'd become. "This is remarkable," she said when she saw me. "What you've accomplished. It exceeds even what we anticipated when you gave your last speech." "The Navy has been generous," I said, which was a polite deflection. The truth was more complex. The Navy hadn't given me anything. I'd taken it, claimed it, built it through decades of deliberate choice and consistent effort. As people began to arrive, I was struck by how recognizable everyone remained while also being completely transformed. We were in our mid-40s now, which seemed impossible. The skin around our eyes had deepened. Our bodies carried the marks of time and choice, and the particular way that life shaped physical form. Some people had gained weight, some had lost it, some had had procedures that made them look ageless in a way that seemed expensive and slightly desperate. Everyone had aged in the particular way people age when they stop being the people they were in high school. Evan arrived with Chloe. When he saw me, he nodded in recognition, but he didn't approach. I appreciated that. The coffee meeting had apparently accomplished its purpose for him. He'd made his peace with what had transpired, and now he could interact with me without the weight of unresolved business. During the reception, people asked me about my career, about what it had been like to rise to flag rank, about whether I'd had mentors who'd believed in me. I answered their questions with the kind of generosity I'd learned over the years. Most people weren't asking out of genuine curiosity about the specifics of my path. They were asking because they were trying to understand something about choice and commitment and the way that time transforms possibility. I tried to give them answers that addressed that deeper question. Tessa arrived around 7 o'clock, impeccable in her dress uniform, carrying her own particular kind of authority. When she saw me, she smiled with the kind of recognition that only came from years of shared experience. We'd both chosen the same path, had both sacrificed in similar ways, had both arrived at a place where we could look back and see the distance we'd traveled without needing to defend it to anyone. We had dinner together at a table with a few other former classmates who remembered us both, who were curious about our military careers and asked intelligent questions about it. After dinner, the program began. Deborah took the microphone and welcomed everyone. She talked about the passage of time, about how the high school they'd attended had changed, about how the students who graduated now were living in a completely different world than the one we'd inhabited. She acknowledged the difficulty of reunions, the way they forced confrontation with choices made and paths taken, the way they raised questions about whether you'd become the person you'd hoped to become. "Tonight," she said, "we have someone with us who I think represents something important about possibility. Someone who had a clear vision 25 years ago about who she wanted to become, and who has achieved that vision with remarkable integrity and consistency. I want to welcome back Rear Admiral Cecilia Jameson." The applause was immediate. I stood, adjusted my uniform, and walked to the microphone. I could feel the room watching me, could feel the particular attention that came from being the most successful person in your graduating class, or at least the most publicly successful. The one whose achievements existed outside the realm of experience for most of the people assembled. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you all for that welcome. I have to admit, when I agreed to come back here, I wondered what I could possibly say that would be more meaningful than what I said 5 years ago. But I think I've figured it out. 5 years ago, I talked about proving people wrong. Tonight, I want to talk about something different. I want to talk about the cost of becoming who you're determined to be, and whether that cost is worth paying. I paused, let my eyes adjust to the lights. 25 years ago, I sat in this school and imagined a particular kind of future. I imagined serving in the Navy, commanding people, making decisions that mattered. I imagined respect earned through consistent effort and integrity. What I didn't fully imagine was what that future would require of me. I didn't anticipate that it would demand loneliness, that it would require me to sacrifice relationships, stability, the kind of continuity that anchors most people's lives. I didn't anticipate that I would reach the goals I'd set for myself and then discover that achieving them didn't answer the fundamental questions about whether the cost had been worth it. The room was completely silent now. I'm here to tell you that it has been worth it. Not because my life is perfect, and not because I don't sometimes feel the weight of the sacrifices I've made, but because I've built something real. I've commanded people. I've shaped policy. I've mentored younger officers, many of them women, and I've watched them begin to chart their own paths with more confidence than I had at their age. I've contributed to something larger than myself, and that matters. I looked out at the assembled faces, people I'd known, people I'd forgotten, people who'd mattered once and didn't anymore, people who'd shaped me without knowing it. If you're here tonight wrestling with choices you've made, wondering if you chose correctly, wondering if the path you took was the right one, I want you to know that there's no universal answer to that question. There's only your answer. And your answer is legitimate. Whether you chose to build a career or a family or both or neither, the only metric that matters is whether you made that choice consciously, knowing what the trade-offs would be, and whether you've lived that choice with integrity. I paused, felt the weight of the words settle. The particular path I chose required me to let go of certain things. But it also gave me the opportunity to shape the institution I serve in ways that will benefit people long after I'm gone. That's worth the cost. For me, it's worth it. But it might not be worth it for you, and that's okay. What matters is that you're honest with yourself about what you're choosing and why you're choosing it. I stepped back from the microphone. The applause came again, but it felt different this time, less like recognition of achievement and more like acknowledgement of something deeper, something about the human capacity to make difficult choices and live with the consequences of those choices. After the speech, people wanted to talk to me. I spent the next hour in conversation, some of it genuine, some of it performative, most of it containing elements of both. Evan approached me near the end of the evening. Chloe was with him, but she hung back slightly, giving us a moment of semi-privacy. That was powerful, he said. What you said about cost. Thank you, I replied. I realized, listening to you, that I never understood what you were giving up to pursue your dream. I just saw it as something taking you away from me, rather than something you were building for yourself. People rarely understand what they haven't experienced, I said. That's not a failing. It's just how perspective works. He nodded, accepted this. He extended his hand, and we shook. It was a formal gesture, but it felt appropriate. It marked the moment when we could finally acknowledge each other without the weight of old hurt or old misunderstanding. We'd been important to each other once. Now we were people who'd chosen different paths, and those paths had taken us to completely different places. Later, as Tessa and I drove back to the hotel, she said, "You were good tonight." I felt like I was telling the truth, I replied. That's what made you good. We sat in comfortable silence as the familiar streets of Lincoln passed by the car window. In a few days, we'd both fly back to our respective postings. I'd return to my work with the Joint Chiefs, would continue the work of advancing women in the Navy, would mentor the next generation of officers who were finding their way. Tessa would return to her command, would lead sailors at sea, would make decisions that rippled through fleets and influenced policy. We'd stay in touch the way we always did, regular phone calls, occasional visits, the kind of friendship that could accommodate months of separation and still feel immediate when we reconnected. My grandfather had shown me, through his example, that respect came from doing the work with integrity and without need for applause. I'd spent my life proving that he was right. The reunion had been an opportunity to acknowledge that proof, to let people see the distance I'd traveled, to suggest to others that such distances were possible if you were willing to pay the cost. I didn't need Evan's validation anymore. I never had, really. But it was nice to see him finally understand that I'd never been chasing his approval. I'd been chasing something much larger, the respect of myself, the integrity of my commitment, The recognition that a life lived with purpose and authenticity was its own kind of honor. As we pulled into the hotel parking lot, I felt the particular satisfaction that comes from closing a chapter definitively. Lincoln High had been important to me, but I'd outgrown it, had moved so far beyond it that returning was less about nostalgia and more about marking the distance. Tomorrow morning, I'd fly back to Washington. In 2 weeks, I'd be promoted to Admiral. In 6 months, I'd retire from active service and begin the next chapter of my life. But tonight, I sat with my closest friend and allowed myself to feel the particular contentment that comes from having lived a life that mattered, from having made choices and lived them with integrity, from having become exactly who I determined to become. That's my story. Titles fade, but boundaries stick. If this hit home, tap like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the push. Drop your thoughts below. I read every comment. Questions for you. When were you underestimated, and what did you do next? What reunion moment would you rewrite if you could? Where did you finally draw the line with someone who kept taking? If you could talk to your younger self, what would you say before the betrayal? What's one quiet habit that helped you rebuild your confidence? For those with military or high-pressure careers, what's the cost you chose, and was it worth it? Turn on notifications for more true stories about boundaries, respect, and rising anyway.